Hey guys, so welcome back. Couple things before we delve in for lecture 2. One of them is just I want to reframe the scope of agriculture and just kind of impress upon you really just how important the fact that we've become an agrarian species is to just the way we live our lives. So some of the things that agriculture has allowed us to do, because you have to remember, pre-agriculture, we were a hunter-gatherer species. We had to go find our food in the wild, hunt for our food, right? Which meant we had to be able to pick up and move with the seasons. We didn't settle in one place, right? We probably didn't devote much time to education and so on. So agriculture has allowed us to settle in a single place, right? It's allowed us to grow surpluses of food. And with that surplus of food, not everybody had to be a hunter or a gatherer. Some people could become artisans or take on a trade, develop tools, right? And then buy their food from people that grew surpluses, right? Allowed us to begin collecting possessions, right? And build permanent structures. These bigger settlements turned into towns, villages, cities, right? And we were then able to devote time to education and technology and advancing ourselves. Put in air quotes, you can't see it, but air quotes around advancing. What does progress actually mean? But different question for different time. So it's important for you to understand that our entire civilization is built on the fact that we have agriculture and we don't have to spend all of our time looking for food. Okay? But with that being said, what we've talked about then is, if we have agriculture, what are our key nutritional needs and what happens if we overdo the food, underdo the food, or don't do the right types of food. We'll talk a little bit about this potential for this Malthusian catastrophe that is yet to happen and doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon, but still something to kind of have on our radar. What happens, what exactly is a famine? What are we talking about then? And then we talked about this idea of world grain carryover stocks, which again are important. We might have a severe climatic event that wipes out a lot of the crops in a certain region. Having these surplus crops from different parts of the world helps with this food security issue, right? So we can help people out in the event of a major natural disaster or something like that. All right. What we're going to do in this lecture, though, is we're going to look at the principal types of agriculture. We're going to differentiate a little bit between the type of agriculture we do in the developed world and that subsistence agriculture we talked about in previous chapters. And then we'll talk also about some of the challenges of producing more crops and livestock, right? So, we talked about how we've avoided that Malthusian catastrophe because of innovations in the world of agriculture, higher yielding crops, built-in efficiencies with using agrochemicals and genetic engineering, et cetera, et cetera. All right? The text that accompanies this unit is pages 432 through 440. All right? So, like always, I do encourage you to follow up what you hear from me with what you read from the textbook. All right. Let's get into this. So, principal types of agriculture. The first one we will talk about is industrialized agriculture, and that is, by and large, what we do here in the U.S. So now, technically, if you have a little backyard garden, that is agriculture. You are growing food, right? That's not what I mean by industrialized agriculture in the U.S., right? Backyard gardens are great supplement. You get nice fresh produce that way. But when I talk about industrialized agriculture, I'm talking about large farms, right? Using combines and machinery and fertilizers and pesticides often, not always, but often, with huge outputs, but also huge inputs. And so, one of the things we have to remember, so let's say you're a farmer, right? And you're producing some tomatoes. Right? So you got a tomato crop, okay, or you're producing a wheat or something like that, right? This is our final product, the tomatoes, the wheat, the corn, whatever, all right? In an industrialized system, we, in order to get these huge surpluses of food, right, there's a ton of inputs that go into it. right? And this is an important distinction for us to understand is, yes, we can produce a lot of food, right? Yes, we can produce probably a lot more food than we currently are, a lot more variety, okay? But in order to do so at these vast quantities, right, we have huge inputs from fossil fuels. Okay? Huge inputs of fertilizer. And typically, not always, but typically that's going to be a chemical fertilizer, right, that was synthesized in a laboratory or some sort of manufacturing process. Pesticides, right? We don't want to lose food to those annoying little insects that cause trouble. And then, of course, machinery, which I suppose fits in with that fossil fuels. But we need, we have plows to kind of cultivate the land. We have to plant the seeds. Then we have to grow the food, right? Obviously, water is going to be an important input there, right? And then we have to harvest and transport that food, okay? So machinery, trucking for the transport, right? These require immense amounts of energy and time, right? Now, it's not entirely a costly process, right? Because, again, part of what we've done with industrialized agriculture is we're able to produce so much corn and so much wheat and so much food that it drives the cost of that down for us a little bit. So at the supermarket, we do sort of appreciate this super efficient, immense process, and the fact that we can sort of get our food for relatively cheap, right? But the everything that goes into it requires immense amounts of energy, right? Just to produce those nice looking tomatoes or bananas or almonds or that wheat for our staples, the rice, the corn, whatever, right? So that's industrialized agriculture, okay? Lots and lots of food, huge production, relatively efficient in terms of the time and human energy needed to put into it, which is great, right? But heavily reliant on agrochemicals and fossil fuels, right? And there are problems associated with that we will get to later, all right? To contrast that with, in more of our developing world, a lot of the agriculture is this subsistence agriculture. And we've already defined that term, but just a reminder, that's just when you're growing food just to support yourself. So we're not trying to go sell a ton of wheat at the market, right? We are growing a variety of foods, livestock, etc., just to feed our family and maybe sell a little bit of it, okay? And so shifting cultivation, which basically you move from one plot of land to the other, right? That's that slash and burn agriculture that's wiping out our tropical forests right now. Nomadic herding, so in the parts of the world where it doesn't make sense to try to grow crops, but there are grasses, we can move livestock around like we watched about in the land resources unit. Intercropping, of course, just simply means growing several different types of crops. So a wheat farmer grows a ton of wheat to sell, and they buy the other food they need. In subsistence agriculture, they grow a large variety of types of foods because they're trying to meet that variety of varietal needs for their diet. Okay? So this is low input in terms of fossil fuels and agrochemicals and things like that, partly because they don't have money to afford those things. They don't have the machinery and so on. But it's labor intensive. And that's another thing to consider too is if we're not using a lot of machinery and agrochemicals, there's a lot of labor, right? They're out weeding the fields and cultivating by hand, maybe using animals to help, right? They're not spraying herbicides and pesticides, right? They're out there kind of by hand doing all this. So labor intensive, you get much lower yields. But in a sense, it's probably a more sustainable practice because we're not heavily reliant on a non-renewable resource to make it happen. So there's pros and cons to both, right? One of the things that the book is not super good at describing is what's called the Green Revolution. Now, first of all, in today's language, right, the word green is often associated with the environmental movement, right? We're going to be more conscious of our energy. We're going to buy organic foods or sustainably produced foods and so on. In the world of agriculture, the Green Revolution does not equal the environmental movement. Okay, I just want to make sure that is understood. It's not that all parts of the Green Revolution were anti-environment. It's just that it doesn't mean green in the sense of, I'm being conservation minded. Okay, this is referring to the fact that we are greening parts of the world with agriculture, right? We're able to grow crops in the desert, for example, by tapping into groundwater, etc. Okay, so that's what Green Revolution means in the agricultural world. All right, so essentially, the transformation of agriculture began in 1945, largely due to the work of this gentleman, Norman Borlaug. Now, if you ever get a chance to read about this guy, we just don't have time in class, but this guy went through basically hell and back to essentially save about 1 billion people from starvation. Just intensively got after plant hybridization and so on, and developed what they call miracle wheat. And they adopted his techniques to rice and corn and so on. Okay, and basically he was able to take the amount of food we could grow on a parcel and triple it. Okay, and that's a huge innovation in the world of agriculture. All right, so Green Revolution essentially occurred in 3 phases, right? And when we talked about staving off that whole Malthusian catastrophe, that's because of the Green Revolution, right? These huge innovations in the world of agriculture that basically it had a huge impact on our yields, our ability to produce food, that pushed back that Malthusian catastrophe to whenever or if it ever happens. Okay, and so what we're going to look at is this occurred in 3 phases, but a few sort of caveats. Really, it's only benefited industrial farmers, not small farmers, because a big part of the Green Revolution is farmers get really good at growing 1 or maybe 2 things. Okay, it's only increased certain crops, so primarily rice, wheat, and corn. Okay, these staple crops that aren't generally or traditionally crops in Africa. Okay, because we're growing so much more food, you still need the water for it, right? And we still need, we're depleting the soil so much more quickly that we have to have an increased input of both water and agrochemicals just to keep up with that demand. Okay, so these are some important things to consider. It's just because we have the capability to grow more food, we still need the nutrients from the soil, right? We still need the water to support the transport of those nutrients into the cells of the plants. All right, so if we're going to increase food production, we're going to increase demand for soil nutrients, we're going to increase demand for water. All right, but what does this Green Revolution look like over time? So phase 1, right, between about 1950 and 1970, basically it just looked like bigger and better machinery, right, more efficient ways to produce fertilizers, better and more targeted herbicides, which kill plants, and pesticides, insecticides that kill our pest insects, right? So the first phase was essentially big inputs of machinery, agrochemicals, and so on, all right? And with that, countries like the U.S. started producing excess food, and we started exporting that food. So this is kind of the beginnings of our global trade in the food world. Right? Phase 2, and again, between 1970 to 2000, this gentleman, Norman Borlaug, was credited for this, but our abilities, our understanding of the way plants breed and genetics increased enough that we could go from a traditional, rice plant like you see here, per plant, to producing these rice varieties that are way, they're not as tall, so they're less prone to getting knocked over, for example, and the amount of rice per plant is significantly, and so, like I said on the miracle wheat, 2 to 3 times more productive. So one plant can produce 2 to 3 times more rice than an older variety of that plant, just simply by breeding techniques and using what we know about genetics. So this is what we call selective breeding. And this is not the same thing as genetic modification, right? Genetic modification refers to much more advanced scientific techniques where they're actually getting into the DNA of the cells and pulling out parts or adding parts to create new, genes that weren't originally part of that DNA. Selective breeding is just taking, like with any population, any species, there's a variety of characteristics. It's refining the breeding techniques so that we produce just the characteristics we want. So we get more of we get less variety in terms of what the plants look like, but we're able to then say that, if I plant rice seeds in a rice paddy, that all of those plants are going to be of the high yielding variety. Okay, that's the phase 2. And then phase 3 is really what we're just scratching the surface of, we think, right now. It involves actually getting into the DNA of organisms. All right, and bringing genes into a population from different types of organisms altogether that wouldn't be there. So what we can do with bioengineering and genetic modification is we can make higher yielding crops. So we can take certain varieties and make them even more higher yielding than we were able to do with selective breeding. We can make them taste better, right? So maybe they produce a little bit more of this type of sugar, or they produce a little bit more of this type of acid to change the flavor of those, right? Easier to transport, so maybe they're less likely to go through those cellular or chemical reactions and spoil, right? We can make them more drought resistant. So in areas of the world where we are prone to drought, or sometimes there are water shortages, maybe through genetic modification we can engineer some crops that don't require as much water, and so they're better able to tolerate low water conditions, right? We can make them more pest resistant. So certain plants produce their own natural pesticide, and we're actually already doing that, where we're taking the Bt toxin from a bacterium and putting it in a tomato plant. So the tomato produces Bt toxin that is toxic to insects, right? And we can actually make them more nutrition dense. And I brought up that vitamin E rice I was part of it, that society has developed, right? So that the rice is not just a source of carbohydrates, but also a source of some really important vitamins that help prevent child blindness and so on. All right. So what we can potentially do with genetic engineering is to really change the nutritional value of our food, change how much water is required, how much agrochemicals are required, right? How much can we grow on an acre of land, right? All these possibilities exist in this third phase of our green revolution. And like I said, we're kind of just delving into it. We've done a lot already, but there's a whole world of possibilities out there with genetic modification, right? And it is important to note, some people have some objections to genetic modification of food, and we will have a discussion about that in class. But for the most part, all the scientific data says that as far as safety is concerned with you and me, and eating a genetically modified organism, there is no change in whether this is safe or unsafe to ingest. All right. Now, there's some other things to worry about, but we'll come to that later. All right. Last but not least, right? If we then move the industrial system over to livestock, right? So we're talking sheep, goats, cattle, pigs, chicken, right? That kind of thing. How do we increase the yields of those? Well, One of the things we do in the U.S., although this is on the decline, is to basically give them some hormone supplements, right? So just like you might give a person human growth hormone to try to stimulate growth or whatever, right? It's been common practice to provide cattle especially, but really anything with these hormone supplements to help them grow larger, so that each individual cow, each individual chicken or pig grows to a larger size than it would be if we just fed them. All right. U.S. and Canada currently do it. There aren't any laws essentially banning it, but for the most part, people don't look on the idea of this growth hormone being in their milk and their food very fondly, because if that gets passed on to us, how might that impact our hormone levels? People are pretty conscious of that, and it's kind of been phasing out over time. One of the things, though, and we've actually touched about this back in first semester, is the use of antibiotics. And we use antibiotics in our livestock for two reasons. The primary one is by feeding antibiotics to our livestock, they actually end up larger. Why exactly that is, there's various hypotheses around that. One of them is by killing the bacteria, or a lot of the bacteria in the system, you're reducing competition for the nutrients into your body, right? So your intestines right now are full of all kinds of actually good bacteria, right? But those bacteria aren't there just to be nice. They're there for food. And as you pass food through your intestines, bacteria is using some of that food as well, right? If we wipe out a lot of the bacteria in your system, theoretically, more of that nutrition goes to the organism, right? So by feeding antibiotics on a regular basis in low doses, it generally causes our livestock to be larger, all right? That's increasing our yield, right? Now, also is, particularly with chicken and with cattle and pigs late in their development, they are confined to these really small spaces. They're called CAFOs, C-A-F-O. That stands for Concentrated Animal Feeding Operation. Basically, that's we put a ton of animals in a small space and we fatten them up for the slaughter, essentially, right? But when you confine a ton of animals to a small space, basically walking around in their own feces, right, bacteria and disease can just spread like a wildfire. And so administering antibiotics on a regular basis helps to prevent the spread of disease, right? So 80% of antibiotics in the U.S. are used for livestock operations. Only 20% of those antibiotics are used to treat sick animals, right? So basically, most of the antibiotics produced in the U.S. go to livestock to make them bigger, right? Now, what does that mean for us, right? This is one of the things we've already talked about and watched the video on. But as we keep supplying antibiotics, right, for the use of making our organisms larger and for the purpose of preventing sickness in animals, antibiotics become less effective over time, because antibiotics don't kill all bacteria. They just knock the population down enough that our bodies can then start to take over, and it helps our immune system have to fight a lower population of bacteria, right? But over time, what happens is we start selecting only the bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics, right? And so then, over time, antibiotics become less useful because a larger percentage of the population of bacteria is resistant to those antibiotics. And when a larger population is resistant to antibiotics, they don't work, right? And we start getting people dying from things like staph infections and E. coli, right? Whereas we had more or less kept that at bay for a long time at the onset in the discovery of antibiotics. All right? And this is another topic that we will bring up in class again as a discussion point, because it's really important. But as far as notes go, I'm getting a little bit long-winded, so I'm gonna hit the end here. So make sure, though, you do follow up with the reading from those textbook pages mentioned.